I make it 6:30.
So do I.
And therefore welcome to this meeting of the Housing Committee on the 9th of September. Item 1 is questions from members of the public and members of the council. I don't think we have any members of the public, although I should have welcomed Araba and Mike first of all. But can we make sure that everybody is muted, please? Okay. Right, I'll start again. Questions from members of the public and members of the council. We have no members of the public. Questions from members of the council. I believe that Dean has some questions.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just bear with me a moment. I've got two questions really for both this committee and the members of the council. And I don't really expect any answers or comprehensive answers this evening because they're quite two big and heavy subjects. But yesterday there was a press release about the Affordable Homes Programme from the government for the next 5 years, which is £11.5 billion being released for affordable homes. I understand that details of that programme are yet to be released. So my first question is, how do we as a council get more affordable housing and meet our affordable housing targets? And my second question is, how do we as a council get the 9 times income price house price ratio, which was quoted in a recent document, down to 4 to 5 times income to make homes and rent affordable, as 4 to 5 times income is what mortgage lenders will lend to somebody when purchasing a home. So they are my two questions.
Thank you. Is Tracy or John, one of you going to answer that? Or yeah.
Certainly, it's Tracy. Certainly, I can deal with Councillor Croft's first question if that's okay. It's an very interesting question. Yes, we are still waiting to hear about the Affordable Homes Programme, and we're waiting very eagerly to hear about that. The question really it will form the basis of a report that's due to come to committee in January. So hopefully that'll be really interesting for everybody with maybe a bit more information. But in the meantime, there are a few things we can say about how we can deliver more affordable housing. The first and most important really is to deliver the local plan sites that have an affordable housing requirement on them, because those are the most significant contributors towards supply. We have to rigorously defend viability appraisals that seek to reduce affordable housing on schemes, and that's definitely part of our strategy for delivering more affordable housing. We're keeping our eye on the market, the housing market, because the delivery of affordable housing is sometimes counter-cyclical. So when the market turns more difficult for developers, sometimes they're interested in delivering more affordable housing because it keeps their supply going. So maybe not right now because the market's picked up a bit, but we're keeping an eye on that and seeing whether there might be opportunities for our registered providers to buy more dwellings from developers. We also are working with registered providers to try and identify schemes where they do more affordable housing. So there are a couple of sites, one at the moment in College Street, the Grand Union are building all affordable housing on, and a site that we did recently in Derwent Place, and again another site at the Wixoms. That's a way of delivering more than we would otherwise do. Registered providers also build on sites they own themselves, so BPHA and their garage sites, and there are redevelopment opportunities. There are rural exception schemes which don't deliver large numbers, but they do deliver higher percentages of affordable housing. And we're also doing some things where the council are sort of looking to sell their land to registered providers, like at Balliol Road, where BPHA is doing an all affordable housing scheme too. We've also got our eye on something in the recently published NPPF. There's a paragraph in there, paragraph 71, which talks about exception schemes for all affordable housing. Now that's a little trickier for us at the moment because people might have put forward their sites in the call for sites in the local plan review, but once that's adopted, there might be opportunities for us to do some slightly larger exceptions all affordable housing schemes, and they're the ways in which we deliver affordable housing. And I guess the answer to the question really is we need to be doing as much of it as swiftly as we can and as rigorously as we can to make sure that we meet the targets that we've got for our affordable housing.
Thank you, Tracy. That was a very good explanation at short notice. Dean, do you have a supplementary question?
Not at this point, Chair, no.
Okay, if I could maybe just pick up on question 2, Dean. The affordability ratio is based on 2 numbers. One is the average wage in the area, and the other is the average house price in the area. So if you're going to change the affordability ratio, you have to change one of those 2 things. Neither of them are particularly susceptible to council intervention in terms of increasing people's wages or in terms of bringing down house prices. The government's view is that the number of houses available, if that goes up, should reduce the price. That's supply and demand economics. I'm not sure if that market reacts in that way. It's part of the reason that the government has introduced all of these things like 5-year land supply to try and boost the number of houses being built in an area, and why it's introduced its new standard method for calculating housing need, which results in higher targets for house building. I think the jury's out on whether those 2 things will be effective at the moment.
Thank you. Dean, do you have a supplementary to that?
Just a comment, Chair, that absolutely agree with what John has just said regarding the average income of the area and the average house price as well. It's very hard to control when we do have a history in our council of building the number of houses we need every year, according to the NPPF, but other areas around us appear not to be doing that. So the supply and demand equation nationally never gets met because there's never enough affordable homes being built at the moment. So my personal ambition is to see how we can get affordable homes built, not just in Bedford Borough, but across England, so we can get the supply and demand and hopefully the income ratios down.
Thank you. You've still got your hand raised. Do you want to take that down? Okay. The next item, item number 2, to receive any apologies for absence. I think we're all here, but whether Alison wants to confirm that, or Jeremy?
Yes, I think everybody's here.
Thank you. Item 3, check the minutes of the last meeting. Are they agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 4, the disclosure of local and or disclosable pecuniary interests. Members are reminded that where they have a local and or disclosable pecuniary interest in any business of the council to be considered at this meeting, they must disclose the existence and nature of that interest at the commencement of that consideration, or when the interest becomes apparent in accordance with the council's code of conduct. Are there any declarations? No. Okay. Item 5, we move on to the presentation from Just Us, the homelessness advocacy charity, and we have got Mike here and Araba. So are the 2 of you speaking?
I think I'm going first.
Okay.
I can't actually see Mike on the list.
I'm here.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. I'm sure most of you have heard of Just Us, especially those of you on the Housing Committee. And I see some familiar faces here. I have met the Mayor, I've met Wendy and Colleen, but I'm not sure if everyone on here is aware of who I am. So just to introduce myself, I'm a barrister in private practice. My name is Araba Taylor. I practice from Fenner's Chambers in Cambridge, but I used to practice from Lincoln's Inn. I've been a property lawyer ever since I came into practice in 1985. And until 2009, I did a reasonable amount of housing and homelessness. I've always done a lot of housing, and I did a little bit of homelessness starting in 1993, which gradually became to be quite a substantial part of my practice. I was based in London, and I used to act for applicants and councils. I acted, I think, for Waltham Forest, for Hammersmith and Fulham, and for Kensington and Chelsea, but I also represented applicants on legal aid. And in 2009, or 2008, 2009, when in fact I moved from London, that work disappeared. And the reason was council budgets were really cut back so that they could only afford to instruct chambers where they had half a dozen members doing the work. And my chambers wasn't like that. And my legal aid work disappeared because they brought in the franchising system, and most of my firm instructed me to take on a housing franchise, let alone homelessness, because the rates being offered were so low. So they went for more profitable aspects of legal aid work, if any aspect of legal aid work can be described as profitable. So then that left a huge gap in the market. Many more law centres in those days, and they did a lot of this work. And you would find also perhaps to an extent that CABs would do some of this work. But we've now reached a stage where an awful lot of the work is being done by charities like Just Us. This, to me, is absolutely wrong. It is legal work. It ought to be done by lawyers. It is the application, particularly in relation to homelessness, of the relevant provisions of the Housing Act 1996. This should not be left to charities, but it is. And when I moved to Bedford in 2011, and I was looking for a homelessness charity to volunteer for, I was really delighted to find Just, because so often what you find in the charity sector is the charity is looking for a way to change the law. What Just Us says is, no, we're happy with the law, we just want to see it better implemented. And that, of course, is music to the ears of a barrister like me. And I would also add that in 2013, I began to sit as a deputy district judge in the county court. And of course, some of you may even have been involved in cases that have been in front of me, because I do a lot of the possession lists when I'm sitting. So again, it's something that's very gratifying for me to be involved in a charity which is to uphold the law and to be better applied. The issue I think that preoccupies us at Just Us is the gatekeeping, which I think is something which all councils are aware of. It does cause offence, and it causes, people, makes hackles rise sometimes, but it is a recognised phenomenon, and it's due, of course, to the financial situation that many councils find themselves in, which means that although they have a vast body of people who are applying to them who probably are owed housing duties of one kind or another, the gatekeeping means that they are sent away. And even within the legislation, there's what I always describe as pushing people over the parish boundary, which is where it's possible to refer people to another council for housing. And it's obvious why that is done. It's very unfortunate. It's extremely unfortunate for the applicants. And there's a huge amount of case law of councils taking each other to court because a homelessness decision has been made by one, which results in another council having the full housing duty. I know that happens in this area too. Just Us works with 9 local councils, not just with Bedford Borough. And we see this too, in particularly councils who haven't got a very efficient housing department or something of that nature. The applicant may well apply to a different one. And if you have a council which is very good and very efficient, obviously that's a place that will attract applicants. There's something very wrong about this, and I have discussed it with councillors, not here tonight, about a regional approach. Because it's quite clear that it's not appropriate for adjoining councils to be vastly different in terms of their practice and the availability of housing within their geographical area. Just Us is a very active charity. Mike and recently John Allen, 2 very active caseworkers. In the year to last November, they directly supported 150 individuals from 89 households over the course of the year. And since that time, we've taken on 100 more individuals. Personally, I think that when lockdown ends, there will be a mushrooming, because the fastest way into homelessness at the moment is losing a private sector tenancy. And we know, and this is what I see very much when I'm sitting as a judge, there is no answer to a no-fault application for possession. And we see families who've moved 6, 7, 8 times in the last 5 years, including families with school-age children. There's no doubt that there's going to be even more of that when lockdown and Corona finally come to an end. Our approach at Just Us is very effective in getting favourable housing decisions for our service users. What we find is that if people approach a council by themselves, 86% of the time they're sent away on the basis that no housing duty is owed, when in fact it is. If they come to us either at the review stage or an appeal stage or from the outset, it seems to go right down to 13%. So obviously the advocacy is crucial. Now, of course, I would say that my training is as an advocate, but I think the figures speak for themselves, and it's a pleasure to be associated with a charity which achieves such brilliant results. And we do very much aim to be the voice for those people who can't speak up for themselves. But what we also do is we are very alive to the facts, and I know Colleen participated in an event during Homelessness Awareness Week last year where we were very much emphasising this, that in fact when somebody approaches the council, the onus is on the housing officer to identify whether they might. So, and we know that what happens often is that people will be given a leaflet, they'll be given addresses and so on and so forth. But in fact, probably in that situation, the housing officer ought to be identifying them as homeless. If there is a possibility that they might be homeless, then they should be given temporary accommodation. And again, this is another issue. Have we got sufficient temporary accommodation? That accommodation has to be suitable. On the other side of the coin is that we often find people who have been put into temporary accommodation and never get out. So they're in temporary accommodation for 6, 7, 8, 9 years. Which again is a scandal because that accommodation is not suitable for them to live in long term. It's temporary accommodation pending the inquiries so that they can be housed properly somewhere in the medium or long term. And we know that this isn't happening. Another aspect of the work that I very much enjoy is that we are involved in training. And I used to deliver shelter training, so that was courses, and I used to go around the country to housing departments, homeless persons units up and down the country, delivering in-house training devised by Shelter. And the nice thing about Shelter was that you also got to contribute to the development of the courses. And Just Us is very active in training. And I know that at least 7 councillors from Bedford Borough have attended our training. I know that we're looking forward to hosting the Mayor at our training on the 2nd of October. And we find that this is a very, very useful way of training volunteers or small charities in identifying what homelessness is. Because many of us, as private individuals, we're involved in helping the homeless. You know, we donate to a food bank, or we support our local church or mosque or synagogue in perhaps a soup kitchen, or helping people complete welfare applications or job applications. What we find as Just Us, and I think this is true, is that what people don't realise, those people of goodwill don't realise that there is actually a right to have a homelessness application considered. So what they're doing is they are helping people to stay homeless, in effect, or ameliorating the awfulness of being homeless. But what they're not doing is taking it to the next stage and saying, did you know, under the law, you could make an application, and that application would have to be considered, inquiries would have to be made, and there's a lawful route out of homelessness, which could result in you having medium or long-term accommodation. I just want to make 2 more points. I know I'm on a tight time scale here. We believe at Just Us that there's absolutely no reason for homelessness to be an intractable, long-term social evil. We believe that all the solutions lie there in the law. The law ought to be applied better across the country. Certainly it ought to be applied better on a regional basis, otherwise you do get a sort of, not exactly forum shopping, because our applicants aren't quite that savvy, but certainly you get people being aware that, you know, if they've got a choice of places to apply, that they might apply to the place which handles their applications more efficiently. But we do think that there is scope for charities that we work with, and probation services, mental health services, and any charity that is engaged with the homeless to know the law better. So we do absolutely do a lot of training, and we do from time to time put in papers and by way of campaigning on particular issues which arise. Now, Mike is better equipped than me to deal with any issues that you might have arising out of Housing First, but I'm sure that all of you will have heard of this process whereby applicants who often have a range of social and medical, mental health problems, addiction, and so on and so forth, or are fleeing from domestic violence, which is a huge category, homeless applicant, that Housing First offers them accommodation before trying to tackle those problems. Now, you will have been closer than I to what's been happening at the Hotel Mercure with the rough sleepers who were funded to be taken off the streets because of COVID, and who seem, it seems to me, to illustrate perfectly that if we can provide the housing, homeless people turn their lives around. I know that there's been a much better outcome nationwide. One sees it on the news, hears it on the radio, a much better reaction nationwide with rough sleepers taken off the streets than people had anticipated. There were lots of fears about what would happen to the hotels if they were full of homeless people, and those fears have not been realised. I've also spoken about families trapped in temporary accommodation, and the real issue is the lack of suitable housing stock. So I would see there's twin problems which Just Us campaigns about. One is for better practice within local authority housing departments and homeless persons units, and the other is for better housing stock, a better amount of housing stock. We just had an agenda item on affordable housing. Personally, this is a personal view, one of the reasons I volunteer. I don't think anybody's doing enough on affordable housing. Certainly in relation to price, the definition of affordable housing is usually beyond the means of the people that probably ought to be housed, and there isn't enough of it. And those are large political issues. The same thing, that's an area where Just Us has an interest in campaigning. And I think what I'd like to say to finalise really in relation to lockdown is that we are clearly setting up a crisis of phenomenal proportions if we do not tackle the housing of families. It is an outrage that they're expected to put up with a 6-month short hold tenancy, which is then determined without fault, and they have to move on. And those of us who've lived in our own homes for 5, 10, 20 years, perhaps we're living in the home we were born in or a home that was owned by our parents. And then there's a vast swathe of the population who move on all the time, who never finish unpacking the boxes, who can't have kids over for a sleepover, who can't build up relationships with children at primary school or secondary school. And we are building up a crisis of phenomenal proportions if we do not tackle that problem. And it's my privilege and my honour to be involved with a homelessness charity which does its very best to see people into medium and long-term accommodation, and which achieves such amazing results with all our local councils.
Just a point, I guess, since John and I set the charity up in 2014, I think it's just been something which I guess is difficult to pick up in numbers. I appreciate a lot of this kind of discussion and debate is all around resources and kind of finance and everything else, but I just wonder how many hundreds of people in our borough have experienced that kind of that injustice of kind of walking into a council, not knowing their rights, and kind of being leaving that building without actually having had the assistance they're owed. And I do really wonder just how big an impact that has on the town and has on our wider borough, and just in terms of kids growing up, as you say, in kind of in insecure housing for their entire childhood sometimes. And I think, whilst it is a kind of question of numbers and making the finances add up, I think it's really important just to bear in mind just how damaging homelessness is for everyone, and kind of effectively how we're going to see the kind of the effects of that for gender. That's all I'd add, and I guess I'm also here if anyone's got any specific questions about the casework side of things that I might be able to answer that Araba won't be able to.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Nice to see you again. We bump into each other at quite a few virtual meetings, and it was nice to see Araba again. Right, any questions now to Araba and Mike? If you want to raise your hand in the screen, because I can't see everybody, so I can't see you waving at me. Are there any questions? Dean.
Can I just, I'm interested in the figures you give, saying that 60% of people that come to you, correct me if I'm wrong, say that they have been gatekeeped, and then when you get involved, that reduces down to 13%. When I look at our stats on the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, between January and March, we assessed 261 households, and we see them.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think, I mean, first of all, just the point to say is that, yeah, that stat that we've got is from across the 9 or 10 boroughs we've worked in. But actually, when we crunch the numbers, it's pretty much the same across all. So in terms of Bedford, it is about 86%. And there's a nuance to the stats. So 86% of people who are told there's no duty to house, there actually is one. So actually, that takes a bit of unpicking. I think in terms of the question you've raised, Councillor Crofts, is basically, I'll give you an example. So in 2016, we did a Freedom of Information request to Bedford Borough Council. And the question we asked was, how many people approached the council and gave them reason to believe they might be homeless, thus triggering Section 184 of the Housing Act? And how many homeless applications were accepted? Now, we got quite a small amount of data, so we kind of extrapolated it for the year. And it would suggest that something like 1,000 households approached the council and gave them reason to believe they might be homeless, but only 400 homeless. Whereas actually, one of the problems with gatekeeping is, of course, that people walk in, they say they need help, they give the council reason to believe they might be homeless, but they get told for one reason or another there's no duty to them, and they've never actually given that decision in writing. So I'm going to guess it's never actually picked up in those stats. And so that's essentially the work. When we talk about gatekeeping, we're not just talking about that act of not triggering Section 184. I appreciate that's a bit of jargon, but we're also talking about perverse decisions. So people who are obviously vulnerable from any definition. And it's probably worth saying that the definition of vulnerability within housing law is not terribly high at all. So for example, someone who's just attempted suicide twice, being told they're not vulnerable, that's kind of something that we would kind of call gatekeeping, but technically it's not. It's kind of poor decision making, I guess. So I think those kind of issues, so we kind of see issues around people being told they're not priority, because they're not vulnerable, because for whatever reason. People told they're intentionally homeless when they're actually not. Again, it's very difficult to actually be intentionally homeless, and obviously very few people choose to be homeless or choose to take actions that leave them homeless. So I think those are the kind of things we're talking about. So it's not just people who are gate-kept. It's people who are told they're non-priority, and we appeal it, and that gets overturned, or they're told they're intentionally homeless. So I think and I think it's got to be statistically significant. Both John and I are both part-time. I think if there was a service that had capacity to deal with literally everyone who was homeless, I think these numbers would probably be replicated, would be scaled up. And I think as I say, Bedford's not. We've encountered much worse councils than Bedford for sure, and there's a huge number of complexities with it all, and difficulties that kind of officers have in their day-to-day. But ultimately, I guess the problem for the council is that the duties on the council, I don't think there's currently the resources available to actually discharge those duties lawfully in a very substantial number of cases. So I hope that answers it. In terms of, I hope that goes some of the way to answer your question.
Yeah, definitely clarifies it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see that Councillor Oliver has her hand raised, Sue.
Yep, thank you. Mike, in your recent dealings with Bedford Borough Council, what would you say we do well compared to other authorities? It's nice to hear the positive first. And then what do you think we could do better? Because, again, we want, within resources, of course, we want to find out what we need to improve at.
I think it's maybe a conversation that'd be worth having, not in a public meeting, I guess, to some level. But I think, speaking candidly, I personally, as a personal view, I think when John and I started this work, the sense we got was that the council was unwilling to really kind of consider the law carefully and kind of actually and follow through with it. I think that there's a number of new people in the teams. I would now say, to me, there's been a change of culture. There's been a change of kind of approach where I think the officers generally want to do the right thing. They are just very limited in what they can do. Ultimately, if that FOI request from 2016 still holds any water, you're looking at least needing to double the resources available to that team for it to really kind of do what it needs to do. And I would say that actually, I've said before in one of the reports that personally I think it's a guesstimate, but I think you're going to need something like 4 times the resources, to really kind of tackle that. So I think there's really committed officers in those teams. There's there's people who really care about what they're doing, and I would say that they've got that unfortunate kind of position to have to live with, where they want to do the right thing and they can't always do that. They can't always get it right. So I think there's that. I think there's a kind of a real kind of willingness we've seen to take on better, to kind of get more knowledgeable about the work. Because I think that the other thing to say is that housing officers are not only kind of working housing, but they're also working within the Care Act, because many people have care and support needs. They'll also be working under the Equality Act because many people have disabilities, and so I think there's that kind of that knowledge. We certainly see that people want to take that. They want to do the right thing. I think in terms of I think that there's kind of been a number of issues which we've seen which are not so good. I think again it's something we see across all councils. We see kind of the thresholds within law being exaggerated. So whereas there are some very low thresholds within the law for helping people, we see that kind of being artificially raised. And that means that many people who are actually owed a duty, initially get told there isn't a duty. And I think there's again, speaking candidly, temporary housing officers are problematic because I work with I had contact with a temporary housing officer in Luton who basically said to me, look, I don't care what you do, I don't care if you complain, I don't care if you get upheld, because in 6 months' time I'll be working somewhere else and it doesn't bother me, and I'm going to get my £25 an hour. So I think there's that, and again, I know that the kind of the Bedford team is kind of working to just on a restructuring, is kind of working through those kind of issues. But I think that's two that spring to mind. I think there's many more. I think we would certainly welcome as a team to kind of speak to anyone who'd like to know more about this. And I think the homeless restore training, it's free for councillors. I think if anyone's interested in coming along on the 2nd of October, there'll be more dates later. I think it's a good day to really kind of get a grasp of what those legal duties are that the council has to many people. So again, I hope that's kind of answered the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on now to the Mayor.
Yes, thanks very much. And thanks for the presentation to both of you. Really appreciated. And just in some of the comments, I think it is incredibly frustrating. And myself and Councillor Oliver have been probably on some of the same committees since 2002. And I think since we've been in the administration, we constantly say about the lack of resources. So you mentioned the Care Act, SEND, this deprivation of liberties, you didn't, but we're also worried hugely about mental health, which will obviously causes or can cause homelessness and problems, but also exacerbates any issues you've got. And we're really worried about the increase of that and about some of the problems that we think children will have in families, which all could add to this, the homelessness issue. But also for our point, actually massive impact on resources. So each of those teams could come to us and say we need more resources, and they almost certainly are correct. And it's really worrying when we are facing another £23 million of cuts as affordable. This new 30% discount is coming affordable, and developers will tend to, in my experience, drop what I would see as affordable and some of the social rents, and build shared ownership ones, build at 30%, and there's a very small percentage that go to the people that can least afford it and probably need the most support. So I'd welcome not just the training, and I'll come to that in a minute, but most said, because actually the more housing there is, the more affordable housing, the better. When we look at temporary accommodation, we are really struggling to get temporary accommodation for people because there just isn't the accommodation out there. So would welcome those conversations going forward. Finally, I just wondering, I just put something in the chat, the private chat, Mike. I did offer the 2nd of October. It'd be great to have a conversation because I have a meeting with about mental health that I've set up for some time. So I would like to see how I can make the 2nd, so we could have a conversation offline. That would be appreciated. So I was shocked when Arabelle said it, because I had offered that date on the 23rd of July and hadn't heard back. So we'll have a conversation. We'll do what I can. I was struggling with my diary, thinking where's school gone, but anyhow,
Okay.
we'll see what we can do. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Did anybody? Yeah, are you coming back on what the Mayor said? Yeah.
I think just I mean the problems that brings. I think we're ultimately going to continue to see homelessness for many years, and I think the resources could be used probably more effectively.
If I may, Chair, I know we've discussed housing first, and I think I'm asked, if we can, as a holistic system, all the examples I've seen have been where it's been pump prime some money. So the one in the Northwest moment has been pump prime by government money, and maybe we should make bids. But I think we need to look at how we can do that without pump priming. I think other ones have been pump primed by third sector, and sort of I'm sure Just Us haven't got the money to pump prime housing first. Otherwise, you might be full time. So if anybody knows examples where it hasn't been pump primed by private money, I think that'd be really good to try and share those. Or how did the authority in the Northwest get it? I think it may have been Liverpool, definitely around the Merseyside. So I think that we would welcome any information that anybody can share about housing first, and is there something we could do to maybe bid for some money to start it off, because it's not cheap to start, and the benefits are some way down the line to achieve them. I think long term it does make sense, but obviously you've got to put money up front to try and get it running. So we welcome that if anybody's got any ideas.
Fine, thank you. Yeah, if anybody has any ideas, then obviously come forward at a later date. Mayor, you've still got your hand up. You
just an old hand.
Okay, right. Fine, thank you. There's nobody else indicating, so I'd like to thank Araba and Mike. Really interesting, really informative, and I think that we will all benefit from having heard more about Just Us. So thank you very much for coming along.
Thanks very much for having us.
You are welcome to stay, or you're welcome to go. It's up to you.
Got the kids put to bed, so I'll be seeing you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Araba.
Right. Okay. We're now moving on to item number 6, which is the future strategy of prevent rough sleeping to prevent. So that's Lee, and we've got a report.
Thank you, Colleen. So the committee has previously received regular updates on the situation with rough sleeping. Clearly, the situation's changed very dramatically over the last 6 months with the impact of the COVID measures and I'm not sure whether it was a request or an instruction from the government to basically provide accommodation for everybody so that they were able to protect themselves from COVID, to self-isolate if necessary. And also that affected the hostel-type living arrangements, particularly the night shelter and the Somewhere Safe to Stay hub, which weren't considered suitable because of the shared nature of the accommodation, shared bathrooms, cooking facilities, etc. So at that point in time, most of the hotels in the borough had decided to close, as they'd been instructed by the government. They could only remain open to house key workers or people that would otherwise be homeless. Well, fortunately, the Mercure Hotel was willing to accept a block booking for people that would be rough sleeping. That was as well as block booking for NHS key workers and some key workers from the prison. So we initially booked the hotel for an estimated 60 to 70 people, which was the people that we're aware that were currently rough sleeping, which was around 30 people, and the people that were accessing the Somewhere Safe to Stay hub. Difficulty saying that today, and the night shelter. Initially, people moved in. I think at the height, which was very early in April, we had 64 rooms booked because we were expecting that many people. And then the number of rooms has gradually some really close links with many of the health bodies, which is something that has perhaps been a struggle in the past in terms of rough sleeping. with mental health services and drug and alcohol services, and that's continued right through until today. We've currently got 40 rooms booked, which are more or less full. We have 2 or 3 rooms vacant from time to time. But I think one of the telling things is the number of people that have been accommodated. So the original group that we identified, and many of those have moved on. So at the time we're writing the report, we'd have a total of 170 people that stayed at the hotel. And just to sort of explain that, going back to some of the points that were made earlier, generally in the past, temporary accommodation has only been provided to people that the council has a statutory duty to provide it to, which is somebody that is vulnerable or has dependent children. So anybody that's not classed as being in priority need wouldn't have been provided with accommodation. So over the period of time, this has changed slightly from the people that were off sleeping with very high support needs to providing accommodation for people that would otherwise have no option other than to sleep rough, but didn't necessarily have those very high level. And I have provided a table there at 5.14 that just demonstrates how successful the move-ons have been. So, obviously there are some people that have just moved away, disappeared from the area, but the vast majority of people have actually moved on to some form of longer-term settled accommodation. Clearly, it was a huge success, and not just in Bedford, but in many other local authorities around the country that house people. And the government effectively brought forward an accommodation programme that had previously been announced with the view to moving away from the short-term emergency and interim accommodation that's been provided to providing something that will be more settled. And that really has formed the basis of an exit strategy for the Mercure. We look carefully at opportunities for very short-term solutions, and nothing that we could see that would be available in the borough would provide the benefits that we have with the Mercure. So ultimately, we've submitted a bid to the government for funding to continue the current arrangements right through until the end of the current financial year. And then for the longer term, we are proposing to provide 46 units of supported accommodation. And the intention at the moment is that this could be delivered through a combination of modular housing and the conversion of a vacant office block. And there is capital funding available towards the cost of the capital acquisition and works, and there is funding available for the following 3 financial years for more intense support services. But the expectation is that by having the housing and a rental income stream, that will enable a more sustainable approach. The bid was submitted towards the end of August, and I've just had an email earlier today from MHCLG, which is indicating that it will probably be towards the end of next week before we have information about the likely outcome of the bid. It is more than a little bit frustrating because the timescales are very, very tight in terms of being able to deliver the accommodation by the 31st of March. There is a second funding round, the details of which haven't been announced yet, but clearly there's also the pressure that around the hotel accommodation. The Mercure is willing to extend the booking, but they are seeing increasing numbers of commercial clients coming forward, so they have a decision to make around whether they can reasonably continue to provide the accommodation. So at the moment, we're really just awaiting for the outcome of the bid and hoping that will be successful. I'm happy to take any questions around the items in the report.
Any questions? If you raise your hand. Councillor Croft.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just thank Lee publicly for the work he's done on this and other matters, especially we had travellers in my ward over the weekend and they were quickly removed, and I know Lee has got many hats. So I'd just like to express my thanks, especially for my residents in my ward for all of his work and efforts he did over this weekend, which was actually tremendous. Just on the report, Lee, I was a bit, well, I'll ask the question. Are there any risks to us and implications for our resources For example, what happens if we don't get the government grant?
There are certainly risks. In terms of if we don't get the government grant, then the council will have to make a decision on what it wishes to do in terms of the ongoing accommodation, certainly in the short term. There is a significant cost to the arrangements that we have in place at the moment. So that will be challenging. There will also be risks associated with the programme if we do get the funding. And at the moment, there is no commitment in terms of the development of the housing. Once we have a decision, then there will be a need for a further executive decision taking into account all those risks. It's difficult to quantify them at the moment until we know the position with the funding, whether we will be allocated the full amount that we've requested. It's possible that we may be given some of the money that we've asked for. As was, I think the Mayor mentioned earlier, actually finding temporary accommodation is very, very challenging. And finding temporary accommodation for where you can provide support for people with quite complex needs is even more challenging. So, and the real frustration, we were originally expecting to have an indication from MHCLG very early in September, which would have given more time for us to consider the options. The fact that today has just been pushed back effectively by a further week is making the situation more complex.
Thank you. Any other questions? No?
Councillor Moon has his hand up.
Okay. Thank you.
So I haven't mastered the skill of putting a mechanical hand up, as it were, or electronic hand. And some questions, Lee, on the table at page 514, or the paragraph 514. First, what was the average length of stay? And secondly, what's the maximum at any one time?
I'm not sure. On the average length of stay to hand, I think that's something that we'd have to follow up with. There is a real mixture. Some people move through very quickly, and we do still have a small number that have been there throughout, which I think is in the report somewhere from memory. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
It's 7 that's been there the whole time, I think.
Did anyone? You get that, Lee? Maximum at any one time?
The maximum number of rooms we had booked was 64. I would have to double check our records as to how many people were actually in there, because clearly, as you can see on the table, we have also tried to prioritise people getting into various forms of supported accommodation with the various different providers. But the funding we had for the Rough Sleeper initiative covered both in-reach and outreach. So the outreach support was aimed at people that were out on the streets. The in-reach was to continue to support them once they got into accommodation. Over the last 6 months, most of that in-reach support has been within the hotel and assisting the people there. But both King's Arms and Smart do continue to provide some support to people when they move on to other accommodation. I mean, I think one point that I would make, and I need to check, but the people that have gone into other forms of accommodation, I'm not aware of anybody that has ended up coming back to the Mercure, that has lost that accommodation. And that's clear. It's one of the difficulties that we experience with people rough sleeping is, and I think the point that you're making, Councillor Moon, that people end up in accommodation, they don't have the support that they need, and within a period of months, they find that they can't sustain the tenancy, and then they're back to the homelessness service. And that's clearly a cycle that we want to break. And as part of this Big Four funding for the supported accommodation, that's a key aspect of that bit.
Thank you. Any more questions? I know we've got comments. Any more questions? Because I think the Mayor has a comment. Okay, Dave, if you want to make your comment.
Yes, thanks very much. I just think it's worth thanking Lee and a whole host of people that have actually helped with this. So from council staff to, as Lee's mentioned, King's Arms and Smart, I think ELF, GPs. There's been an array, and it's really good to see, and hopefully we'll continue that when we're out of the hotel in terms of support and the range of support we can give. So that's been a really good example. But then also personal thanks to Lee, because not only have we been at March, but also while we're looking at the long-term solution, of course, there's the medium term. Should the hotel want the rooms back, what do we do and how do we support the people that are currently in the hotel? So it's been quite a juggling act, and so far Lee's done an exceptional job. That's a little bit of pressure on him, because I think the juggling will get more complicated as it appears that different people throw extra things for him to juggle. People that went into the hotel and the support we've given them. There are lots of figures, and I thought it was the report said 7 people had been there from beginning to end. I may be wrong there, but if you look at the throughput, and I didn't know that we hadn't had any people coming back, I think that's a good thing. We've also had some people recently from Number 10 come to look at our COVID-19, and they went to the hotel and they were impressed and thought it was a model that others should be using. So again, external praise. Still got a long way to go, because if we are to produce something by the 31st of March, that will not be easy. But I think you know that anyhow.
Okay, thank you very much, and I will pass that thanks on to the team and the partners that have been involved in this. I'm sure they'll very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Councillor Oliver.
Thank you. Let's try to work out how to get this hand down before you tell me off. Yes, I was going to make the comment that it's very few positive things have come out of this pandemic, but one of the good things is what's happened with the homeless. I mean, in Bedford Borough, we've always told the truth about our number of rough sleepers, even though that was an uncomfortable figure a couple of years ago, and we've shown a real willingness and determination to get those numbers down, and we haven't managed to attract funding through.
Any more comments? No. Well, I'm going to reiterate exactly what the Mayor has said and Councillor Oliver has said. The amount of work that Lee and the team have done has been absolutely tremendous, and the challenges have been absolutely huge. So where we are today is down to the hard work and the dedication of a really, really hard-working team. So thank you very much, Lee, and to the team and everybody else who has contributed to it in the different ways. We've got some recommendations, and the committee is requested to note the current position regarding accommodation for persons who would otherwise be sleeping rough. Number 2 is the contribution made by local partners and the Mercure Hotel. Hang on. My doorbell has rung. Yeah, item 2, the contribution made by local partners and the Mercure Hotel to ensuring that accommodation and support is available to people who would otherwise be sleeping rough during the pandemic. And number 3, which is that a bid has been submitted to the government's Next Steps accommodation programme with a view to securing funding to enable the long-term provision of supported accommodation for people at risk of sleeping rough. Are we happy to note that? Yeah.
Agreed.
Agree.
Thank you. Right, moving on then to the next item, which is the Empty Homes programme update. And again, I think that would be Tracy, will it?
Will be.
This is the regular update that we provide to committee to brief you on what's happening with the Empty Homes programme. It's been an interesting period covered by the months in this report, which is October 2019 to May 2020, including the period at the beginning of lockdown. Committee will see that during that period, the number of empty homes increased by 56, and always members wanting to try and understand if something like that has happened. We've done a little bit of analysis to show that 57% of those are in the 1 to 2 year category. Sorry, I've been sent it out. The 1 to 2 year category, and also that half of that increase have actually been in probate or care cases, which we usually tread lightly on for obvious reasons and reasons we've discussed before at committee. We've been trying to assess the impact of COVID, so we've been keeping some notes about what people have told us. We've still been sending out our empty homes letters, asking people, you know, what's been happening, and there have been a large number of people who said they'd have sales fallen through, or people who said they were, you know, starting work on their properties, but they've been unable to continue that during COVID because they haven't been able to get access to builders, etc. The better news is that since lockdowns finished, people have been ringing us and telling us that properties where they've had sales fallen through have been sold, and that work is underway. So we're hoping that the next time we bring report to committee, there'll be that will start to show in the figures. I guess that's a brief summary of where we are. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Tracy. Questions? If anybody is waving at me physically, I can't see it. Ah, okay. Councillor Oliver.
Thank you, Tracy. It's a very comprehensive report as usual, and you're right, the figures are more disappointing, but I'm pleased with the analysis that you've done to show why that is. My question is, given that the change in emphasis was normally you pay attention to the longer term empty properties, you know, over 10 years, will what's happening with the figures at the moment change your approach or the way in which you're working on these, perhaps, properties that have not been empty for quite so long?
Okay. Really, no. With that's, I'm just thinking, is that just a straight no? No, not really. What the ones where that are longer term empty homes, we've continued to work on through the lockdown, because a lot of those are where we know works, we know either know where work is happening, or there've been strategies for dealing with them, and we've tried to stay in touch with the owners during that time. And I hope there's a page, let me find it on the report, where we've got a few that are just about long-term ones that are just about to go, we hope are just about to come off the report. It's on page 7.9, which we kind of hoped might be off before we wrote the report, but didn't quite make it. So, for example, the property that's been empty for 26 years is now off the empty homes list, and that's because we've been keeping going with those during the pandemic, and really those longer term ones we're still working on, and we're hoping that most of those will be off by next time. So I guess the more softly approach has been with the ones that are at the bottom end of the time scales, because we know those people have had sales that have fallen through, or where they couldn't get most of those do come back of their own accord in the end. So so we've not been concentrating on the very long term empty homes during that time.
If I can just come back with a further question, the 300% increases in council taxes now kicked in, I believe. Are you beginning to see any benefit, shall I term it, any benefit of that decision of the council?
Absolutely. Certainly one very long-term empty property, the owner was not very impressed that they were going to have to pay more in their council tax. And we know that's been a big influencing factor in bringing that property back into use. And we regularly hear this from people, you know, I can't afford to leave it empty anymore. And that's a really great thing. So it's definitely been an influencing factor, yes.
Thank you. It was good to hear you mention that about the 26-year home as well. Right, the Mayor.
It's probably just an add to Tracy's answer there. My inbox for casework is definitely showing an increase. More than a handful of people about complaining that they're having to pay double council tax if the home's been empty for more than 2 years. So I'm seeing the effect as well, but I hold the line all the way through because it's quite right to do so.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? No. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Tracy. I know that this is the same way as earlier when you were answering the questions, that you are absolutely passionate about bringing homes back into use and about housing in general. So thank you very much indeed. We've got a recommendation, and that is that the committee consider this report and, if satisfied, note the progress in implementing the Empty Home Strategy 2019 to 24. Is everyone happy?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. In which case then we are moving on to the next item, which is the committee work programme, which is item number 8. Jeremy, you normally take us through this?
Yes, so you've got the work programme there in front of you. It's fairly well set out. I always think it's a good idea just to consider the item, or have a look at the items for the next meeting of the agenda. So 4th of November, you've got the housing strategy, which is reviewing the consultation responses, and then the annual item for Rough Sleepers winter scheme.
Okay. Is everyone happy with that?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Fine. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to our presenters who have now left us from Just Us. And that will be the end of the meeting, finishing now at about 19:36, is it? Thank you very much.